Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Crude oil jumps back toward $100 a barrel as the new Supreme Leader says the strait will remain shut. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio as the Ayatollah delivers his first public remarks since succeeding his father. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. And Kailey, the last 24 hours have brought many sobering headlines from the Middle East.
Well, and you're certainly seeing that reflected, at least in the oil market. Yes, the Iranian Supreme Leader is suggesting Iran is not backing down, and President Trump is suggesting, frankly, that the U.S. is not ready to do so either. As he last night in a speech in Kentucky talked about how we are winning, but you don't want to say you won too early or leave too early. Yeah. And also on social media today is suggesting that he thinks making sure Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon and his other objectives with Iran are more important to him than high oil prices. Despite that, perhaps, Joe, you are still seeing the administration taking arguably most of the action they can to address high oil prices. 172 million barrels of oil released from the SPR that announced yesterday, and now apparently they're looking at Jones Act waivers.
Then you know when the Jones Act comes up in this conversation, things are not well in the oil market. We've seen this movie before, and we've seen these prices before, Kailey. WTI, West Texas Intermediate, closer to $95 right now. We saw triple digits overnight, and Brent is just about back to that level as we speak.
Yeah, so is this going to turn into something of a reinflationary spiral? The market may think so, as we are now seeing fully priced out any further Fed cuts for this year.
That's going to be a doozy of a news conference next week, and this could be a disappointed market. It's really interesting, though. We have to acknowledge the fact the S&P 500 is down again, as Charlie will tell us in a second here, but we're still actually not that far from our highs. And once that deterioration begins, this could be a very different feel here in Washington.
It absolutely could. And we go now from Washington to New York. As Joe mentioned, Charlie Pellet always checking the markets for us, so we'll look to him now. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there. Indeed, stocks lower across the board. Energy surging as President Trump and Iran's new Supreme Leader are striking defiant tones on this, the 13th day of the war, offering little relief to energy markets. Brent crude briefly topped $101. Right now, barrel of Brent, $99.25. It is up 7.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude, $94.70. WTI up now by about 8.5%. Energy prices certainly front and center, even as President Trump yesterday announced that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve will release 172 million barrels from the U.S. Emergency Oil Reserve. Also, sources tell Bloomberg the Trump administration plans to waive that century-old maritime law, the Jones Act, to blunt surging oil and gasoline prices. Equities lower. Right now, we do have the S&P 500 index down 75, a drop there of 1.1%. Dow Industrials down 526, also down 1.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index is down 302. For NASDAQ, a drop of 1.3%. The VIX at 25, the 10-year 4.23%. Gold down $52 the ounce, down 1%, $51.23 on spot gold. Crude, though, the big story, West Texas Intermediate up 8.5%, down $94.59, and Brent at $99.24 a barrel. Among energy-related names, the oil majors, ExxonMobil up 1.7%, Chevron up 3.3%, ConocoPhillips up by 2.7%. A gunman is dead. 2 people are hurt after a shooting at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. ODU says a gunman opened fire in its business school building, injuring 2 people who were sent to the hospital. Not clear how the shooter died. Recapping, S&P down 76, down 1.1%. Back we go to snowy Washington. Your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Snowy indeed, Charlie Pellet, after it was in the mid-80s yesterday. I have weather whiplash. But whiplash, of course, is nothing new to us in Washington, especially these days as we're following conflicting messaging each and every day, sometimes within the same hour, on the war in Iran. As President Trump suggests that it could end soon, but also that you don't want to leave too early. And Iran, of course, is suggesting it is not yet ready for this conflict to be over either. In fact, Iran's top security official, Ali Larijani, out on X today saying, and this is a quote, Trump says he is looking for a speedy victory. While starting a war is easy, it cannot be won with a few tweets. We will not relent until making you sorry for this grave miscalculation. So Iran saying the president has not won yet. President Trump, though, is saying the opposite. This was him in Kentucky yesterday.
We've won. Let me say it, we've won. You know, you never like to say too early you won. We won. We won the bet. In the first hour, it was over. My administration, as you know better than anybody, is also working to keep the oil flowing. It's flowing all over. We knocked out, you know, they want to drop some mines. Very friendly people, mines, so boats blow up. And we knocked out every hour I have to change because they knock them out so fast. I've never seen anything. Think of it. They knocked out 54 ships in 2 days.
54 ships in 2 days. President Trump speaking in Kentucky. We won, as he said twice last evening. The market doesn't seem to agree. And Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall starts us off ahead of our conversation with Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Tyler, it's great to have you as always, and I'm glad you're not on the snowy North Lawn today. With regard to this rhetoric, is it only the president who is saying that we won?
Well, when we hear other officials speak about the confidence of the U.S. military operation and the tactical successes, it is more along the lines of that we are ahead of schedule after, of course, as you know, a few weeks ago or what day we are in now, they had outlined that this could go as long as 8 weeks. And now you hear the administration talk about being ahead of schedule in achieving its objectives. But President Trump, while he is still saying that we have won in his words, and as you just heard, he's also still saying that he's going to sustain this military operation until all of the goals are achieved, going to the mixed messaging that Kailey was referencing.
Well, and the president also is suggesting achieving those goals right now is more important to him than the higher price of oil we're seeing that he said repeatedly he expected. In fact, he thought it might even go higher. So if the oil prices are copacetic in the mind of the administration, why tap the SPR? Why decide to waive the Jones Act?
That's a really important point, because we know that political pressure has been mounting on President Trump as we head into the midterms, and energy prices are a top concern. And we can say that this week, retail gasoline hit its highest price under either of the Trump administration. So there's going to be that building momentum. But as you mentioned, we now have this new Bloomberg News reporting that we could see the administration take a few different tacks here, including waiving the Jones Act. So generally cheaper foreign tankers could move energy commodities between U.S. ports. We also had reporting that President Trump could invoke the Defense Production Act to help spur some offshore drilling. In California, we've heard floated that we could see a federal gas tax holiday, but that would require Congress. Ultimately, we got this SPR release, or we're going to see it. The U.S. Energy Secretary says it's going to take about 4 months. But I'll point out that the head of the IEA says the single most important thing that could happen would be to resume traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. And as of now, this statement that we got from the Supreme Leader earlier indicates that's not going to happen anytime soon.
So it's a quiet day at the White House, right? We got the post that Kailey referenced on Truth Social, but no briefing with the press secretary. The president isn't in front of cameras today, right? So
it actually appears that there was added a 4 p.m. Eastern event, a women's sporting event that we could see him and the First Lady at later today. So that was open to pre-credentialed media. So perhaps we will hear from him later today, but he has a slew of meetings on his public schedule that are private and closed to the press. So at this point, we're just really watching to see what he does post, because as you all know, he's been quite active this morning so far. Sure.
Yeah, and in one of the very same post where he says that dealing with Iran is more important than high oil prices, he suggested when oil prices go up, we make a lot of money. So he's arguing that not only is this not negative financially, but actually could be net positive for the United States
and domestic producers, as it appears he's referring to there. And we do have some reporting that the administration has been in active discussions with domestic producers to help with output, but in particular replenishing the SPR. We know that that's a politically fraught issue at the moment. The U.S. is set to withdraw 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. They have pledged to refill it by the end of the year with an additional 200 million. But as it stands right now, it's at about 60% capacity. So there's going to be this push to get more barrels in if prices come down. And that's where we're starting to see those discussions with domestic producers and the private sector.
There are a lot of questions about a supplemental funding request. There had been reporting, Tyler, as you well know, last week that it could have arrived by now. We still don't have a number. We don't have a sense of timing, do we?
At this point, we don't, but there are estimates that it could be in the billions. We've seen some estimates of 50 billion, but that seems to be on the low end, according to reporting, which is pretty interesting. And there are, of course, concerns about government spending. But we had confirmed at Bloomberg News earlier today, one of our colleagues at Bloomberg Government, that indeed, behind closed doors, U.S. officials had briefed lawmakers that the U.S. spent more than $11 billion in the first 6 days of the war. And that doesn't include the buildup of U.S. military assets in the weeks leading up to it. We're just talking about those tactical expenses that were incurred during that first week. So that's going to lead to questions. Questions then becomes, will this pass? It kind of seems like there could be momentum there. Joe, you and I spoke with Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, a Democrat from Florida, who told us that she would be on board. We'll see some sort of
saw a number.
Before she ever saw a number, or before we even raised the question on whether or not there could be sweeteners put in for Democratic lawmakers, like farmers' aid, like disaster relief funding that may actually grease the skids to get it along.
Well, and when we consider that the U.S. at least is still actively considering naval escorts for vessels to the Strait of Hormuz, even if that hasn't happened yet, I believe the Energy Secretary suggested it could be in the next couple of weeks. Who knows where we will be in this conflict by then? That could only be more expensive and potentially take more actual munitions resources to make that protection adequate for tankers transiting. You've spent time in the Pentagon talking to them about the defense industrial base and the actual acquiring of these very materials that we are now actively deploying in this conflict. The money is one thing. How quickly can using that money to pay for these things actually result in our stockpiles being rebuilt?
That becomes one of the biggest questions. And it's actually a bipartisan issue. It's safe to say that we've seen administrations on both sides of the aisle try to tackle what ultimately becomes the bureaucracy of trying to get a streamlined process to bring in contractors and get equipment out as quickly as possible. We have seen a new initiative under this Army Chief of Staff, General Randy George, who has tried to introduce the idea that maybe we could get shorter term orders instead of, the long-term contracts that the defense primes often get into. Try to get in some more new tech companies to try out their equipment and get that supply chain up and running faster, because that really does become one of the biggest questions. In fact, you'll recall then Senator J.D. Vance, before he was vice president, was often talking about this isolationist policy. And that was in part because he said that he needed to see U.S. domestic stockpiles brought up to a greater level before we expended resources abroad. And that may be a fissure that we start to see again as the timeline remains uncertain.
All right. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, thank you so much, here with us on Balance of Power. And joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio is the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time. We began this segment a few minutes ago with the President Trump last night saying that this war is already won. Is the U.S.'s definition of winning the same as Israel's?
Very good question. Good to be with you. It's a question that's being asked by many Israelis today. Israel had very specific goals to certainly prevent Iran from rebuilding its nuclear program, to deny Iran the ability to manufacture these very, very large missiles that have been hitting Israel, about each one with about a ton of explosives in their warhead, and finally to bring about the cessation of Iranian support for terrorist proxies throughout the Middle East. They're trying to destroy us even tonight. And originally, that was also America's position. I don't think that the Israelis would agree that almost all the targets have been destroyed in Iran. And I think that the issue is, in the end, what does the day after look like? Tonight, the Iranian president issued basically conditions to the United States, saying there has to be just an unconditional ceasefire, but the United States has to pay reparations to Iran. And the United States has to issue guarantees that Iran will never again be attacked. So that gives you, I think, an idea of where the Iranian mindset is. They do not believe they're on the verge of defeat.
Okay. Well, Ambassador, and thank you again for joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio. You have suggested that there will be no Mount Suribachi moment in this conflict, referring to the flag raising on Iwo Jima. When will then? How will we know that this war is won?
Well, there'd be one of two ways. One, if the Iranian regime says, okay, we're not going to make a nuclear weapon, we're not going to make ballistic missiles that can hit Israel, we're not going to support terror anymore. Or, barring that, a popular uprising, or perhaps even a coup within the regime, within the ranks of the IRGC or perhaps the army.
Okay.
Now, to achieve that, it may be a long-term proposition. It's a big question whether the president and the people of the United States are up for that. And here the model would not be Iraq and Afghanistan, those forever wars, but really the Cold War, where the United States remained very steadfast over a long period of time and brought about the fall of the Soviet Union.
Well, that's incredible to consider, because then we are talking quite a longer time horizon than the Trump administration is suggesting. Knowing that the administration in recent days has been very careful to say regime change essentially is not what they are seeking, but it would be a welcome outcome if it indeed happens. From Israel's perspective, knowing the son of the late Ayatollah is now in power, we got our first statement from him today. Is it going to be acceptable to Israel for the younger Khamenei to still be in power in Iran? Or would you anticipate that until that situation changes, Israel at least will declare that it is not over?
I think, well, it's not so much the person, it's his position. If his position is to maintain Iran's campaign, which began back in 1979 and reiterated every day since then to destroy the state of Israel, then the new supreme leader, Mustafa, will also be considered an enemy and, by the way, a legitimate target for Israel. And that is on our unassailable right to pursue that. If the supreme leader would come out and say, in one way or another, okay, we're going to change direction, and we're not going to seek the destruction of Israel and our neighbors or the United States of America, it might be something different. I just don't see that happening. I think that those three goals of destroying Israel and the United States and dominating the Middle East are in the DNA of this regime, and it's almost impossible for them to change.
Interesting. Ambassador, with that said, there are multiple reports today, including one from Reuters, that finds U.S. intelligence indicates Iran's leadership is still largely intact and not at risk of collapse, with a multitude of intelligence reports pointing to consistent analysis that the regime is not in danger and retains control of the Iranian public. Is it possible to change that dynamic without going in on the ground?
It is, but again, it's the long term. I mean, I referenced earlier the Cold War. I think that at some point the intense military stage of this campaign will end. That Iran's missile launchers and drone launchers in factories will be destroyed, and I think that's happening, slowly but surely every single day. And eventually they'll run out of these missile launchers and the drones, and then the United States could impose a very punishing and strict naval blockade on Iran, ensure that not a drop of oil gets out, certainly no munitions will get in. And then over the course of a certain period of time, probably a protracted period of time, the Iranian regime will finally wither on the vine and be in a position to be overthrown either by the people or by elements within the regime itself.
When we consider, Ambassador, that this is no longer just combat operations in and around Iran. Iran obviously has cast a wide net in terms of retaliation to other Gulf states, even as far as Turkey, where NATO has had to intervene. But Israel also has looked to the north, and there is active firing between Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah specifically. Even if there is some kind of resolution with Iran, the Islamic regime itself, what of that conflict? How is that brought to an end?
Well, that is a very pertinent question tonight. I was in the north yesterday, and the situation there remains very dire. Last night, the north was hit by about 250 rockets from Lebanon. Some of them were quite long range, not just striking the north, but also central Israel. And so I think that the goal there would have to be that even if the United States says, okay, we're ready for a ceasefire with Iran, that Israel has to insist on pressing the campaign against Hezbollah. And there's a very specific reason for this. Much of the Israeli north has been rendered uninhabitable by these missile attacks. And unless Hezbollah is decisively defeated, and in a way that the Lebanese government can regain control over its own territory, particularly in the south, those areas in northern Israel will remain, some of these cities are ghost cities. It's quite despairing. So that is an intolerable situation for any sovereign state, certainly for the state of Israel. And we hope that the United States will continue to give us the very green light we've received up to now in combating Hezbollah.
Ambassador, with regard to the Iranian regime, I noticed a post on Twitter that was reposted by our ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz. It's from author Saul Sadka, who writes, the regime's top brass seems to have decamped to the distant city of Mashhad, as far away from the U.S. bases and carriers and from Israel as you can get without actually fleeing to Afghanistan. Have you heard that report? Is that the case? And the ambassador retweets, writing, if only we still had Bagram Air Base. Do you agree?
I don't know about Bagram Air Base, but I wouldn't doubt that the key leaders of the regime, including the supreme leader himself, are either very, very deep underground or as far away from the combat areas as possible. There have been dozens of these leaders who have been eliminated, 40 of them on the first day of the war, and they're all legitimate targets. And as we know, Iran is deeply, deeply penetrated by the intelligence services of both the United States and Israel. And we tend to know where people are sleeping at night, where people are having lunch during the day, and they must be in a situation of constant fear and constant paranoia, quite legitimately, about who in their entourage is leaking and giving information to the Israelis and to the CIA and targeting them.
It's incredible to consider. Ambassador, finally, before we let you go, we have obviously heard repeatedly conflicting timelines from President Trump as to the duration we can expect for this conflict. At this point, nearly 2 weeks in, would your guess be that this is still weeks more ahead of us, or could it be months or longer?
I really can't answer that for the United States. I can only answer it for the people of Israel. We are sustaining nightly, daily rocket attacks. I run from where I'm talking to you now into the bomb shelter next to me several times during the day, and 2 nights ago it went on all night. We're nowhere near tired. We're nowhere near breaking. We are a very resilient population, very resilient society, and we know that we have no choice in this war. Whether we're fighting against Iran or fighting against Hezbollah, we're in it because there really is no out. The United States has a different set of considerations. It has political considerations. It is far from the Middle East. But I would only stress that if the war ends with Iran basically in control of the Straits of Hormuz, Iran having humbled oil producers around the Middle East, having even humbled NATO, because NATO hasn't responded, that will have very far-reaching ramifications for American security. And Iran will rebuild its capacities. And someday it will threaten the United States much more imminently. And the time to address that threat is not in years to come, but now.
Well, we appreciate your spending time with us and hope you stay safe, Ambassador. Come back and see us again. Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the United States. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey, Leinz, and thanks for being with us here on the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. Before we assemble our political panel, we want to take a look at Wall Street. Charlie Pellet has his update on the markets with an eye on oil, live from World Headquarters in New York. Hey, Charlie.
And right now, Joe Mathieu, we do have West Texas Intermediate crude up 9.1%, $95.19 a barrel. Brent at $99.73, up by 8.4%. Did see a trade above $101. Couple of headlines to pass along from the Bloomberg. The IDF says it has begun strikes targeting Hezbollah across southern Lebanon. In the meantime, the UK Navy says 3 vessels have been struck in the Arabian Gulf in the past 24 hours. Stocks are falling amid a renewed surge in energy. S&P down 80 now at 66.95, down 1.2%. The Dow is down 571, down 1.2%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is down 320. For NASDAQ, a drop now of 1.4%. The VIX just above 26 with a 10-year at 4.23%. Spot gold is down 1.1%, 51.21 the ounce. And again, West Texas Intermediate crude up almost 9%, just above $95 a barrel. Brent at $99.61, up by 8.3%. Microsoft and Meta Platforms have each committed nearly $50 billion in additional data center leases in their most recent quarters, underscoring an escalating bet that the tech industry is making on AI. Shares of Microsoft today, right now, we do have Microsoft shares. They are trading right now down little change, down under 0.1%. A gunman is dead, 2 people hurt after a shooting at Old Dominion Wesleyan University in Virginia. ODU says a gunman this morning opened fire in its business school building, injuring 2 people who were sent to the hospital. Not immediately clear how the shooter died. Recapping, stocks lower, S&P down 1.1%, and Brent crude at $99.54 a barrel, up 8.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. And back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Checking on things across asset classes for us, of course, keeping on top of oil as well. Nearly back at $100 a barrel on Brent, $99.53 right now where we trade. So oil prices are up, as we know, as a result of this conflict between the U.S. and Israel and Iran, translating into higher prices at the pump as well. But President Trump on True Social today suggests it's not all bad because this is a quote, "The United States is the largest oil producer in the world by far. So when oil prices go up, we make a lot of money." Of course, Joe, he goes on to say a far greater interest and importance to him as president is stopping an evil empire, Iran, from having nuclear weapons and destroying the Middle East and indeed the world.
So it makes you start thinking about off-ramps here, which many had presented in the past couple of days. Even the administration still now, the president said last night we won. But actually getting to that point, I think we just established with the ambassador could be a lot more complicated. And that's where we start with our political panel. Joining us today, Democratic strategist Doug Farrar, principal Maywood Strategies, and Republican strategist Maura Gillespie from Blue Stack Strategies. Doug, I'm going to start with you here. As a communications specialist and someone who has spent time in a Democratic administration, you appreciate the importance of continuity and consistency. And we're still asking these same questions more than a week into this conflict. At what point does this administration need to coalesce the message?
Well, I think they should have started before they went to war. I mean, I think if you remember back to the Bush administration prior to Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a very cohesive and long-running set of messages about why we were doing it and what success would look like. And obviously that war was ended both unpopularly and in some corners would be called a failure. So I think they need to get on that right now. I think these sort of in the morning, we want to see oil prices high for shareholders, and in the evening, talking about being done with the war. It's very confusing for people. So it's important they set some objectives, stay clear about that, and stick to those messages.
Well, when we consider that high oil prices and the fact that the administration and President Trump announced yesterday that we'll be tapping 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in order to combat the disruptions we're seeing, he, of course, is not the first president to tap the SPR. President Biden did it as well due to high prices domestically because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Is there an argument to be made, Doug, that actually this particular tapping of the SPR by the administration is using it for the way it was intended to be used, not for political reasons around gasoline prices, because there is a very real shortage and supply risk here?
I think it's a reasonable argument, and it's certainly going to have a short-term impact to delay some of the bigger increases to the price of gas and the price of oil that we'll see as a result of this war. But ultimately, this is not going to solve the problem, which is that Iran views this attack as an existential threat against them, obviously having had their leader killed and attacks continuing across the country, and that they seem determined to impose a huge global economic cost by focusing on the Strait of Hormuz. And so, yeah, you can release strategic oil reserve and do some sort of sanding on the edges here. But ultimately, we could see this economic catastrophe continue for weeks, months, maybe even years.
The president was not checked by Congress on this, Doug. A war powers resolution failed most recently last week in the Senate. I'm wondering your thoughts about the supplemental budget request that we're told is about to drop here. And we're hearing numbers of anywhere from 50 to 100 billion. Maybe it's even more than that when other things are attached to it. And this is to basically replenish what has already been used. $11.3 billion the first 6 days of operations. Will there be a debate even over this? We're hearing a lot of Democrats already say that they will not vote against supporting the troops.
It'll be an interesting and politically challenging situation for a lot of Democrats, although I would urge them to think through carefully about funding for this war and how it'll impact them. I know that Speaker Johnson and others have talked about potentially doing something through reconciliation, which would protect them from having to get Democratic votes. But ultimately, what this is going to do is going to put a very large amount of money up on the board, and it'll be a question whether people who are paying high prices for healthcare because ACA subsidies went away, or paying high prices for groceries because of the affordability crisis, or otherwise have seen the government sort of shut off funding for things that they view as really important, how they compare that to a huge amount of money to continue funding a war that's only raising prices and continuing to become more unpopular. So it'll be complicated for Democrats in some ways, but also the politics of this could be quite straightforward for them as well if they have the courage to understand where the puck is headed.
Well, when we consider the politics for Democrats, keeping in mind that we are now, 4 weeks in, I think, Joe, 27 days, maybe 28 days to the Department of Homeland Security being shut down while there is an ongoing war with what has been repeatedly described, and accurately so, as the biggest state sponsor of terror and concern around domestic risks to the homeland itself. When we talk of off-ramps, do Democrats have an off-ramp here on this shutdown because of the war in Iran, to have an excuse to refund the Department of Homeland Security, even if they don't get every single reform that they demanded on ICE?
I think that's probably right. I mean, obviously people are experiencing snarls and delays because of the lack of TSA agents being able to staff airports. And your point about being a state sponsor of terror and that risk going way up, including Iran threatening attacks against the West Coast, is another aspect of this for sure. So it's possible that this could end up with some sort of off-ramp, although I believe that Americans still retain a huge amount of concern about the way in which ICE has behaved in Minneapolis and in other states. And so, there could be events that come up that derail this as an off-ramp, but it's possible that we could find some way out of this with a reasonable compromise as TSA becomes more and more snarled by lack of staff.
Yeah, it's just probably a matter of time when you've got airports asking you to bring canned goods to the airport for TSA agents. There's been an effort to cordon off ICE funding from the rest of TSA. Is that going to eventually be the way out of this, Doug?
It's possible. I think more important for Democrats will be what concessions they get on things like masks, cameras, and other aspects of ICE's behavior, training, hiring. And obviously there's concerns over these mass acquisitions of places that they intend to use as sort of deportation camps. And if that becomes a story on its own, it could further delay or push out any sort of agreement. But I think hopefully Democrats will be able to find something they can live with, something that actually does something to address the problem and move to end this shutdown.
Well, I guess we're going to have to see whether there's any real focus on that, Doug, if there's any live conversations even still happening between Democratic leadership and the White House, when President Trump has suggested his basically exclusive legislative priority right now is to get the Save America Act passed. He's actually pushing for a talking filibuster in the Senate in order to make that happen, despite the majority leader, John Thune, saying that the votes simply are not there. They do not have the tally to do that. Where do you think this heads, Doug? Are we really not going to see any further legislation coming out of Congress signed by President Trump, because this very clearly, as it stands right now, is not going to be able to pass?
Yeah, I suspect that Trump is going to back down on this, as he has on many other things. I mean, he's going to need to, for instance, fund this war if they're able to find a way to get that through the House and Senate. There may be other things that he wishes to sign. I know that, for instance, the Road to Housing Act passed the Senate today, which is something that the president has called on and is a key part of his affordability agenda. There's also always, of course, the out, which is that if a president doesn't sign a law after a certain period of time, I think it's 10 days, that it just becomes enacted. So there are certain ways in which he can sort of game the system here. But look, the SAVE Act is not popular. It is not something that people are crying out for amidst all these other catastrophes that we're dealing with. And so I think, this is a bit more of a play for the base ahead of the midterms, but probably something that he will taco on, as they say.
Right. I don't know about that, but we'll see if the president has more to say about it himself. To your point, Doug, you can pass a bill, send it to the president, and just let it sit there for 10 days. So maybe there will be a potential to get more done. But when you start talking about the SAVE Act, there's a new move by some Republicans to attach FISA 702 renewal. That's DOA, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if the SAVE Act can get through in any case. And if it does, adding more complicated provisions that, threaten core priorities the president has talked about during his campaign and which his base has become accustomed to hearing seems like a really complicated thing to do. But it's hard to say. And the president, in part, his whole pitch on his politics is to be unpredictable. But yeah, I would tend to agree that it doesn't seem that would help that bill very much at all.
All right, Doug, thank you so much for joining us. Doug Farrar, principal at Maywood Strategies and former senior advisor to FTC Commissioner Lena Connor, Democratic strategist Maura Gillespie. Hopefully we will be able to join us again soon. Joe, when we consider the kind of optics here, beyond the idea that President Trump may essentially grind Congress actually being able to make law to a halt, that's with also Congress's ability to declare war, not necessarily being active right now, as Republicans are on the record voting down, essentially exercising that authority.
They gave him a green light to continue this operation on both sides of the aisle with a few exceptions, and may be a blank check depending on how this goes with the supplemental request. Interesting, Kailey, we thought we'd have that in hand by now. That document, apparently still not written, has not arrived on Capitol Hill. So we're still waiting for a number. We've heard anything between $50 and $100 billion, but we'll let you know when we put a finer point on that. Thanks as well to Doug. To your point, we'll get Maura back on soon, Kailey, and we'll have much more straight ahead. Mayor Fry will join us from Minneapolis next, only on Bloomberg.
We have had a taste of triple-digit oil once again today, even if we're not quite at that level right now. We are very close on Brent, and on WTI, we're still just around $95 a barrel. And it's striking. You would think, if I told you that oil prices had risen some 40% in a 2-week period, that we might be looking at more than a 2.5% decline on the S&P 500 over that same time. There's an interesting disconnect here, if you will. And for more on that, as Charlie promised, Norah Mulinda, Bloomberg television markets correspondent, is joining us now. Norah, what gives here? What is the equity market thinking that the commodity market very clearly is not?
Well, of course, we are seeing major indexes lower today. A lot of investors are really trying to digest what the outcome could be of this conflict and the pressure that it could put on the oil industry. We know that Brent crude has really been hovering around $100 a barrel, Kailey. So we've really been seeing this surge. A lot of people really fearing the fact that this could potentially tighten energy supplies and also the idea of pushing inflation higher. So what I've been hearing from my sources, it's really just a matter of how long this lasts and what that could mean as it trickles out into the broader economy. But you certainly are seeing a lot of angst right now in the market. I'm taking a look at the VIX index right now hovering just below that 26 handle. So that gives you an idea of Wall Street's fear gauge and where it sits right now.
Well, you've got an all-time high just about here, just a penny below it on the XLE. Exxon, Chevron higher. I guess much of the oil patch are we buying anything other than energy?
So I'm also seeing some other things that are in the green. Take a look at the SPX IMAP function that we have on the Bloomberg terminal, and you'll see that energy, utilities, and consumer staples, those are the top three best performing sectors in the S&P 500. What you're seeing right now to the downside is industrials. That's the worst performing group in the S&P 500, followed by consumer discretionary stocks.
Well, when we think about consumer stocks, Norah, it's also interesting as we spend so much time on this program talking about affordability and a higher cost of living, how that's a political problem. When we think about affordability challenges and high prices, we often look at discount retailers or even things like dollar stores. But Dollar General isn't doing well, which I would think the opposite in this kind of economic environment.
Well, this one seems to be a bit more idiosyncratic. So we did see some results out of Dollar General. We see the stock right now down by more than 5%. This is after we are seeing the company heading for its worst day since 2024. If you look at the stock action, we did see an annual and long-term forecast that both disappointed. Now, this essentially is just underscoring concerns that we could have some slowing momentum because Wall Street was pretty used to this company beating after quarter after quarter after quarter. So you are seeing some people really selling off on this name because they did have a high bar for this company and it did miss.
Well, I'll tell you, Norah, it's going to be interesting as we wait for the next inflection point. What does Wall Street need to see, if anything, short of an open and operating Strait of Hormuz, or are we simply waiting around till the next earnings season at this point?
Well, we do get some data in between. I mean, of course, we did get some CPI data that we got to digest, but a lot of people will really be monitoring this situation that we see continuing to evolve, us being on our 13th day of the conflict. In terms of some economic data and different key points ahead, we do have the Federal Reserve meeting next Wednesday, so people will, of course, also be keeping their eyes on interest rates, though I feel as though we haven't talked about the Fed in a while because there's so many headlines that the market has really been trying to keep and decipher here as they look from side to side as to what we should be watching right now.
Well, when we think about the Fed, Norah, I saw the headline cross the terminal earlier today that we've now priced out a full rate cut for this year, which I guess we knew that there was live questions about whether or not the Fed was going to be able to ease with this kind of uncertainty around an energy supply shock and what that will do to inflation. But how is that being reflected in the bond market?
Well, it's interesting. If you take a look at the 10-year Treasury yield right now, it's currently sitting at about 4.2%. Take a look at that policy-sensitive 2-year Treasury yield at 3.7%. And of course, as you mentioned, we do have the Fed meeting next week. A lot of people really focus still on the rate outlook. We know that all the developments that we've been seeing here in terms of oil surging is really sparking investor worry that we could see a spike in inflation coming off of this. So it'll be interesting to see how this trickles out and how the Federal Reserve sits down and really digests what's going on geopolitically, as well as the data that we're getting on the economy and how it actually impacts their outlook for the future.
Yeah, 4.24 in the 10-year. It's important that you point that out, Norah, and it's amazing to think that we actually slipped below 4% for a minute last week or 2 weeks ago at this point. Edward Harrison, who writes the Everything Risk newsletter for us here at Bloomberg, identified 4.2% as kind of the breaking point for stocks here, where investors start to turn in the other direction and say, hey, I can just simply do better for myself with a lot less risk if I start buying treasuries. Does that seem to be the case here, reflecting beyond oil why stocks are lower?
Well, it's interesting as we kind of think about the dynamic between both asset classes, but I also have been keeping an eye on just the activity that we've been seeing in equities so far this year. One thing that's really notable to me is despite the fact that we've been seeing all these headlines, we had tariff concerns, that kind of feels like, in a sense, we could say it's kind of in the back mirror, but still trickling through here. We're seeing an S&P 500 that's down just about 2 percentage points. We're down about 2% on a year-to-date basis. And if you think about investors, they were really used to these double-digit returns that we saw year after year after year. So we're not doing terribly as you look at the S&P 500. It almost feels as though Wall Street is still continuing to push through. As we think about sentiment here, people are really just trying to dig through this uncertainty. Uncertainty has continued to be the word here, Joe. But still, we are seeing an S&P 500 that's down just about 2% year to date.
Well, it makes me smile, Norah, when you talk about how tariffs seem like they're a completely old story at this point. I'm sure they'll come back to the fore eventually. Right. But remember when we were thinking about pre or after tariffs, the last market panic was what? Artificial intelligence driven. Right. And then we were having credit concerns as well. Are those completely evaporated as well?
I mean, yeah, that's also something we've been looking at today because I've been also keeping my eyes on some of the banking stocks. We know if you take a look at the regional banking index, that's ticker BKX, we're seeing a bit of pressure when we look at Morgan Stanley. We're looking at Deutsche Bank and that index, as I just quoted. And this, of course, is after a lot of people really being concerned about the fact that both Morgan Stanley and Cliffwater did move to cap withdrawals from their multi-billion-dollar private credit fund. So there are still some things percolating as people really having some concerns about the private credit market more broadly. But I am hearing from sources that they do feel as though some of these concerns could be a bit exacerbated. You also called out artificial intelligence, something that I feel like we were talking about for quite a bit, but it feels like it's something that's so far ago. But we are still seeing some pressure as we think about people really trying to figure out which names that they think may not have as much exposure to the big spending that a lot of people are concerned as to whether or not will actually pay off here, Kailey.
All right, Bloomberg Markets correspondent Norah Mulinda, thank you so much. Of course, it does seem that for all of those concerns out there, it is concern over geopolitical risk and the ongoing war in the Middle East is the prevailing one right now as we continue to track the headlines. Just in the last few minutes, a headline crosses that the UAE has dealt with 10 Iranian ballistic missiles on Thursday. Today, the Saudis have intercepted a ballistic missile aimed at the eastern region. We know a lot of these countries have had to shut in production, as well as the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed. And of course, the new Iranian supreme leader has suggested that it will stay that way, or should stay that way, despite the protestations of President Trump, who yesterday, speaking in Kentucky, suggested that the U.S. has already won this war. I asked a veteran and a senator, Democrat Elissa Slotkin of Michigan, about what exactly winning is here yesterday when she joined us on Balance of Power. This is what she told us.
The president and his cabinet have been all over the place in terms of what our objectives were. Is it regime change? Is it their nuclear capabilities, ballistic missiles? What is it? I think the truth is that, originally, when it comes to thinking about sort of strategy in the Middle East, one thing we never, ever want to have is another country having veto power over our freedom of navigation, our ability to ship and move things. And right now, whether the president likes it or not, Iran has veto power over what is getting through the Persian Gulf, this very narrow Straits of Hormuz. It's driving up the price of oil. Ships were attacked today trying to make that crossing. Insurance companies won't insure ships. So I think whatever the definition of victory may or may not be, when Iran, under, a different guy, it's not the same leader, you have a different leader, the son of the former leader is now leading, they still have the ability to project power and screw up our shipping. So to me, I don't know what definition he has, because I don't know what his goals are. It's sort of like Venezuela, where it's like you do a couple things and you declare victory and go on. But I'm going to need to see certainly some more clarity on what we've actually claimed to have achieved, and is the juice worth the squeeze when it comes to the loss of life? We've lost lives already, and then also the loss of treasure, given what it's doing to the U.S. economy.
Well, of course, it's not just lives lost. We saw reporting from CBS earlier today that there were actually more casualties in terms of injuries in that drone strike in Kuwait. CBS reporting that includes brain injuries, shrapnel wounds, burns, at least one amputation. Some 30 American service members, according to their reporting as of Tuesday night, were still in the hospital. If we are to see, in the name of protecting shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, actually the beginning of naval escorts and more troops potentially put in harm's way for that reason, is that justified in terms of when we consider the economic consequences that you were just laying out?
Yeah, well, look, you're starting to hear people really hurting here back at home with the price of gas, with the price of just moving fertilizer, like for our farmers, in and out. So we definitely have that request. It's a big deal to make the decision to actually escort with a military escort. And it was interesting because the Secretary of Energy announced, okay, we're going to be escorting ships, and then had to take that tweet down. And to my knowledge, we have not provided military escort for a single ship. So, I think that this is a live issue right now. I will say, with the tragic death of these service people, something that is a new trend in this war is the role of drones, right? Iran's use of largely kamikaze drones into civilian targets, military targets, our embassies, and their ability to evade our traditional missile defense, curtains, like our assets. This is a new type of thing. The Ukrainians are sending advisors to the United States of America to help us with counter-drone technology. I just want to put down this marker. This is a new era for warfare for the United States. The Ukrainians have been living it, and now we are living it too.
Senator Elissa Slotkin, the Democrat from Michigan, speaking with us last evening, reminding that she served 3 tours in Iraq as a CIA agent and now a prominent Democratic voice when it comes to national security. We have a breaking news situation that we want to bring you up to date on quickly before we hand things over to Bloomberg Business Week Daily, with the Associated Press now reporting that a suspect is at large following an attack on a synagogue in Michigan. Indeed, Michigan State Police responding to an active shooter situation at a Temple Israel in West Bloomfield. According to authorities, this is happening as we speak. And Bloomberg national security reporter Miles Miller joins us with what we know at this moment. Miles, what can you tell us?
Yeah, 12:30 Detroit time. A man walked into this temple, which also happens to have a school in Michigan, right outside of Detroit, and put his gun up. It's at that point he was engaged by members of that school's security team, who opened fire on him. What we know is that the suspect is still at large at this moment. We heard from the sheriff just about 5 minutes ago, and what he tells us is that it's at this point right now unclear if there are one or multiple suspects at this time. We know the suspect is not in custody, and we also know that no one inside the school building as of right now has been injured. But this is one of the oldest synagogues in the area. And in addition to that, this is also the first Reform synagogue in this country. So a lot more to piece through with this.
All right, Miles Miller will continue to cover it for us. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you once again at 5 p.m. Eastern Time for the late edition of Balance of Power. For Joe Mathieu, I'm Kailey Leinz. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.